There we go. All right, so hello and welcome everyone. First of all, we had a quiz. So let's go over the quiz real quick. Um, Hold on. I did not pull it. I closed the tab for some reason. That makes it annoying. Quiz 2. There we go. All right. So, um, the keep in mind, if you didn't do too well on it, that is purely to gauge your progress. Um, it barely counts as a grade. It's 10 points in a class that has a total of something like 300 points. So 10 points is not really much. But at the same time, it does indicate how well you're um, perceiving the lectures and readings. So, one such reading was Teddy Roosevelt's Strenuous Life. Um, the His speech about you know what Americans should do. And so the first question was Teddy Roosevelt's Strenuous Life says national greatness is achieved by what? A. Imperialism. B. Physical exercise. C. Strong government. And D. Peace. Um, the answer is imperialism. Um, but um, the title can be a bit misleading if you're just going off of the title, but that's why you're supposed to actually read these. Um, so number 2 is what was the first step of implementing Jim Crow? A. Segregation. B. Lynching. C. Reconstruction. Or D. Disenfranchisement. And the answer is D. Disenfranchisement. Yeah, they had to disenfranchise black people first in order to start implementing other parts of Jim Crow, such as segregation and that hard apartheid that existed for a good half century. Um, Number 3 was why did the U.S. utilize concentration camps in the Philippines? A. To exterminate the population. B. Impose governance. C. Find insurrectionaries in the jungle. Or D. Register Filipinos as American citizens. And the answer is C. Um, they concentrated people into um, camps and concentration camps and declared everywhere outside of the concentration camps to be free fire zones, basically, that anybody of fighting age could be killed by American troops. So technically, it was actually safer to be in the concentration camp than out of it. Um, so of course, that's the purpose. Of course, genocide did follow. Number 4. What gave the labor movement its greatest success? A. Radical leftism. B. Economic depression. C. Nationwide strikes. Or D. Insurrections. And the answer was economic depressions. Um, Especially what we will see next week is the Great Depression. Um, but them actually lowering their rhetoric of communism and socialism and all that helped the cause more than the actual rhetoric itself. So radical leftism doesn't work either, and nationwide strikes always failed. Were quelled pretty harshly. Um, so number 5, what state has a genocide been has a genocide named after it? Um, A. New Mexico. B. Virginia. C. Washington. or D, California? You'll remember from the Western history stuff that that we talked multiple times about the California genocide. So, California. Um, all right. So, are there any questions on the quiz? None? Cool. So today we're going to be talking about, hold on, let me close some tabs. We're going to be talking about the First World War. And its effects. So the World War is quite a turning point in American history, as basically everything is, right? But it comes right in the middle of the Wilson administration and the all the all the U.S. was trying not to get into World War I, but eventually did anyways, and this would have lasting effects. In fact, you could basically say that the Second World War, the largest war in history, not just American history, although it's kind of not the largest war in American history, the Civil War is, but the largest war in all of history, is kind of a consequence of World War One, and this is quite a cataclysm for Europe. And while the U.S. does participate, we come out relatively unscathed. Though the aftermath, as we'll see, turns pretty nasty pretty quickly. But there's a lot of debate as to why the World War I even came to be and why the U.S. Joined it. Because there's actually not a clear answer as to why World War I started and why the U.S. eventually intervened. The beginning of World War I started with basically a bunch of intertangling alliances throughout Europe. One side called the Entente Powers, and the other side called the Central Powers because they were in Central Europe. The Entente Powers were Britain, France, and Russia, whereas the Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire wasn't actually aligned with all of them to begin with, but because of it fracturing into several Balkan states, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had interests in those Balkan states, and when a guy named Ferdinand, an archduke named Ferdinand, traveled through one of these Balkan states, a separatist group called the Black Hand assassinated him, sparking off tensions between the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire, all of which took various sides of which Balkan state they wanted to support. And this grew in tensions throughout all of August of 1914 until finally breaking out in the war that month, bringing the Entente powers on one side and the Central Powers on the other. And the Ottoman Empire eventually allied with the Central Powers, and though technically in a treaty relationship with the Central Powers, Italy did not join the war until fairly late, switching their alliances throughout it and eventually declaring war on the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1916. So the Italians essentially came into the war late on the Entente side. So this is the state of Europe throughout 1914 and 1917, when um, but the U.S. tries to remain neutral this entire time, trying not to engage in this world war. And part of the reason why it's a world war rather than just a European war is that they're all empires. They all have, they had, completely conquered almost all of Africa, save for Ethiopia. Um, had controlling interests in much of the Middle East, um, and throughout Central Asia. Um, so, the entire old world is on fire throughout all of this. Um, but the U.S. Quite early on showed a very clear preference for Britain in this fight. Um, One, Woodrow Wilson was president, and so he already had some. If you remember the previous lecture where we talked a little bit about his dissertation, he had actually shown a preference for the British system of government over the American system of government. He also had a rather dubious advisor named Colonel House, who was not a colonel, but everybody called him that because he was essentially the same thing as like a Kentucky colonel. Um, and this guy was quite popular, quite familiar with British officials and all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories that surround this guy. But he was a close advisor of Woodrow Wilson and very much counseled to favor Britain. Um, of course, the American people were also fairly familiar with Britain as opposed to everywhere else. For even though the U.S. had, of course, revolted from Britain and declared independence in the during the American Revolution, pretty much immediately afterwards, you see people who were very anti-British, very patriotic during the Revolution, um, become very friendly with the British immediately afterwards. For instance, the person who probably egged on the Declaration more than anyone else, a guy named Thomas Paine, had actually moved back to Britain in the 1780s. So, um, there, even though there's this supposed antagonism, there's a much deeper familiarity with the American people. Um, and that carried over all the way to World War One. Beyond that, Prussia, while it was expanding throughout the 1870s and 1880s, had kind of made an enemy of the United States. Um, for instance, the U.S. had had become allies with one tribe in American Samoa, whereas the Prussians became, uh, you know, by the way, Prussia meaning Germans, not to be confused with Russia, but the Prussians made an alliedship with the other half of Samoa. This division is actually still present today. And in 1887, a civil war broke out on Samoa, and the Prussians and the U.S. Navy actually ended up getting in a few firefights during this civil war out in the middle of the Pacific. They and the fighting between the Prussians and Americans ended basically because a storm scuttled a bunch of ships, and they couldn't fight anymore because they didn't have the ships to do it, and they were more concerned about survival. But this is the beginning of the antagonism between Germany and America. With actual shooting. But even in the beginning of the war, the the British made a concerted effort to maintain that antagonism by first they, because the British had the most powerful navy in the world, blockaded Germany, making it so that it was difficult for German goods and German propaganda to get out from Germany. And then, since right at the beginning of the war, Germany invaded France by going through Belgium, um, the British started broadcasting how horrible this invasion was by calling it the rape of Belgium, and they'd show like pictures of like babies on bayonets and um, you know, Germans raping Belgian women and that kind of thing. Um, they were talking about the Hun, as propaganda would call them. Huns being a reference to ancient barbarians who attacked Rome. So, they're depicting the Germans as this like horrible barbarians committing atrocities in that, which of course turns the American people against Germans. Um, and um, what cemented all of this was that, one, the US was engaging in trade with some of these things, but secretly. Um, and the a lot of the time they'd use like cruise liners to trade in weapons to Britain and that. And that's precisely what the Lusitania was doing in 1915, and a German U-boat sunk her out in the middle of the Atlantic. Of course, since it was a cruise liner, it was technically a civilian ship, regardless of the weapons that was in her hull. And this killed a more than 100 Americans. So of course, the U.S. was already teetering on the edge of declaring war in 1915. But surprisingly enough, the most popular song of that year was a song called "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier." So the American people were still very much opposed to engaging in this war. It was a European war, and America was supposed to be its own independent entity from Europe. But of course, Woodrow Wilson kind of set the ground for losing more and more U.S. neutrality, because the U.S. started openly engaging in trade with Britain. He opened up the ability of U.S. banks to loan money, and technically this was able to go to both the Entente and Central Powers, but of course, that wasn't really what it was intended for. For after all, Britain was blockading Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire is landlocked between Entente powers, and so, and of course, the Ottoman Empire didn't really need any more bank loans. So this was very openly pro-British, and so of course the bank loans ended up going mostly to that. They also started in manufacturing and selling weapons to the Entente powers. Technically, once again, it could have been sold to the Central Powers, but blockades. So Germans actually started a huge espionage program in the U.S. to kind of combat all this arms trading with the British, because essentially after 1915, the U.S. was very clearly not a neutral country, just hadn't declared war yet. Um, so they would engage in bombings. For instance, one was in the in New York Harbor, which ended up actually damaging the Statue of Liberty, though that was thought to be an accident until years later. Um, and then there was the preparedness movement, which was essentially um, people parading um, and marching marching to act as if they're in the military to prepare for the possibility of having to go to war. So even even though the U.S. was very strongly opposed to intervention, um, the uh, the U.S. was also very much preparing for it anyways. Um, and this all came to a head with the Zimmerman telegram. You might remember from the immigration lecture that the that this was coming right in the middle of the border war, and the U.S. had invaded northern Mexico in that. And so the Zimmerman telegram was a um, telegram between the German embassy in Mexico and to be sent to Mexican officials. And it basically said, if you invade America, we will help you. We will help you. Um, hair on my glasses. We will help you um, gain back what you lost in the Mexican American War. That they promised Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Um, this hence what's being pictured here is, this barbarian looking guy with many horns and all that kind of stuff, offering a Mexican the fertile grounds of the Southwest. But the other thing that was particularly potent in the Zimmerman telegram was that it also stated that Germans would be engaging in unrestricted U-boat warfare, meaning that they could attack any American ships in the Atlantic with submarines. So this was quite the it was basically a declaration of war by Germany, right? It was decoded by the British, so this has led many people to believe that the Zimmerman telegram is actually British propaganda. That's incorrect. It's a real thing. But the that doesn't stop people from conspiracy theorizing about like the start of the war, and actually like the discontent over all of this and the conspiracy theories and that would lead to a very anti-government conspiracy theory movement that began in World War I and still reigns strong today. You can trace a direct line from QAnon today to that. But of course they're all bigots, so we don't really need to engage in their stupidity. But unrestricted submarine warfare was indeed the final straw, and Woodrow Wilson went to Congress, asked for a declaration of war, and got it. So while technically the U.S. Joined the war in April of 1917, it would take a good 8 months before U.S. troops would arrive in large numbers on the Western Front. Prior to the U.S. arriving, though, there were significant changes in the war because Germany was fighting a two-front war, and the Western Front was not moving very significantly, but the Eastern Front was. Germany had managed to push all the way into southern Russia throughout the winter of 1917, right as the the October Revolution was happening, and the so by the way, if you ever hear people say like don't invade Russia during the winter, Germany did it pretty successfully in World War One. So that's a lie. But the Russians did try to stick it out. They managed to stick it out all the way until March of 1918, when they finally signed a armistice with Germany, basically ceding all of southern Russia to Germany, at least temporarily. And so this was quite the loss for the incoming American forces, because now Germany could suddenly turn all of their focus on the Western Front, which is where American forces were going. And after 4 years of some of the worst warfare the world had ever seen, the Entente powers were, well, pretty beleaguered. They were not ready for this new onslaught. So the Western Front was geared for a truly brutal war by the time American forces arrived in large numbers. And something you have to understand about the First World War is that this is trench warfare. This is very modern warfare. You'd have two parallel trenches with a no man's land in between. And people would try to run across that no man's land in large charges. But of course, the other side would have like machine guns and artillery, and would just mow down these charges. Since the British would actually organize their units according to towns, like they'd muster an entire town of boys to send to the front. This would actually mean that entire towns would lose entire generations in a single charge, because that's how brutal this warfare was. And by late 1917 and early 1918, the Germans had invented a number of chemical weapons, most potently mustard gas, which could kill you if breathed in long enough, but typically would blind and cause decades of lung damage. Permanent lung damage. So people had to wear gas masks and that, and of course the Entente powers responded in kind, creating their own mustard gas. And sometimes, depending on where the wind was going, people would deploy their chemical weapons, and if it wasn't a particularly windy day, it would settle in the trenches, which is why they were using it to try to end all this trench warfare. But if it was a windy day, it could go in either direction, so you might end up gassing yourself. So truly nasty conditions. You're sitting in a trench all day, possibly having to go over the top and die anyways. And so up until this point, it was really just European powers fighting. But once America arrived, it became important to define what this war was about. And good old Woodrow Wilson was happy to oblige. And so probably his most important speech of his entire career was the 14-point speech in early 1918. where he declared that there were 14 reasons for fighting this, what he called a war to end all wars. And these 14 points would be the things that would end warfare forever. As we all know, that didn't really come to pass. But he basically declared that the U.S. was fighting for democracy. We don't need to go through every one of these points, but it's pretty important to point out that he quickly violated some of these. For instance, point number 6 is self-determination for Russia. And if you remember from the Small Wars lecture, he violated that pretty much immediately. He gave this speech only a month prior to signing the order to. No, it wasn't even a month. It was like 2 weeks, signing the what's called an aid memoir to invade Russia. So a lot of it revolved around self-determination, and ending colonialism in that, independence for Poland, and what he called a General Association of Nations, what would later become the League of Nations. And we'll see later that where that goes. At home, the U.S. really clamped down on all of this this animosity to joining the war pretty quickly. They first signed the Espionage Act in 1917, and in early 1918 they signed the Sedition Act, which was an amendment to the Espionage Act. And essentially, this made it illegal to even say anything ill of the war whatsoever, that you would be impeding the war effort, and that was a danger to public safety. In fact, the Sedition Act specifically states, whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military or naval forces of the United States, or the flag of the United States, shall be punished. So yeah, it was basically saying that if you say anything ill of the war, you're risking jail time. And this would have horrible effects. In fact, remember I talked a little bit about the conspiracy theories growing around the start of the war. This had the effect of by trying to silence them, actually making them stronger. Because people think, well, what do you have to hide if you're trying to silence us? Typical conspiracy theorist BS. But these Espionage and Sedition Acts were designed specifically to aid recruitment. The U.S. needed to recruit a lot of people really quickly, going from a tiny military force to one of the largest in the world. So the U.S. instituted a draft, and so this draft, something you have to understand about the draft is that no point during any time of conscription in U.S. military history did conscripted soldiers outnumber non-conscripted soldiers. So if you were drafted, that you might be something like a quarter of the army might be drafted, but this actually worked as a recruitment drive because people will join if they're afraid of being conscripted anyways. Might as well do so voluntarily. So that's actually how conscription has always worked in the US, basically as a recruiting tool. So understand that the draft, most of these soldiers were not actually drafted. But with all of that, it took about 8 months for the US to arrive, right as Germany was turning about to attack the Western Front. But with the influx of American soldiers on the Western Front, the Entente powers were able to rebuff the what's called the German Spring, um, as their spring offensive petered out. Um, the U.S. especially was able to push further and further um, eastward, um, really moving the lines that hadn't moved for years. Um, Many of these hard charging events had to be slowed down because they couldn't be covered by artillery anymore. So that was um, Germany was losing the war very clearly, and then in in the fall of 1918, um, a series of revolts broke out throughout Germany because, well, people are angry at all of this warfare, um, and the Prussian government, the Prussian Empire, is not capable of really dealing with it. So they start trying to form their own constitutional monarchy, or what eventually replaced it was what's called the Weimar Republic, um, which the Weimar Republic became a fully fledged entity in the waning years of the war. So, with all of this happening, Germany is very clearly losing the war. The Ottoman Empire has collapsed in on itself. The Austro-Hungarian Empire has had its own revolts, and it's collapsing in on itself. The entire Central Powers um, are are failing, and Germany, being the most stalwart of them, um, ultimately fails. So after a month and a half of negotiations, while this war continues to be fought, but the U.S. and Entente powers keep sending notes to to the um, German war machine, and they send notes back, basically trying to keep the Kaiser in power. Um, the An armistice was finally signed, um, which went into effect on November 11th at 11 a.m. 11/11/11, 1918. Um, which we still celebrate today. Instead of it being called Armistice Day, we call it Veterans Day, um, because after World War One, it didn't seem right to be celebrating. After World War Two, it didn't seem right to be celebrating World War One only, so they changed it to calling it Veterans Day. Um, but but this was it. The war is over, right? And the U.S. is victorious. Um, the So for the first time in American history, a sitting president left the United States. Woodrow Wilson sailed across the Atlantic to go meet in Versailles, um, a which is near Paris, um, for the final peace treaty that followed the armistice. Um, and so he became kind of the leading figure of the Treaty of Versailles process. Um, but he was more of a ideologue. Essentially, he really wanted that whole League of Nations thing. He kept talking about self-determination and that, but repeatedly, when people from non-white races approached him for counsel, or for trying to get him to actually back up his words of self-determination, he repeatedly refused them. For instance, um, what was called the Negro Caucus, um, but today is just called the Black Caucus. It was met in Versailles in 1918. I mean 1919. Um, the and they tried to appeal to Wilson to stop his Jim Crow, to stop all the Jim Crow stuff back home, and of course Wilson paid them no mind. Um, Same thing happened with a number of countries. For instance, China was technically part of this war, and you know, got further subdivided. In fact, a bigger enclave of Japanese power was given to of China was given to Japan, and this was explicitly on Wilson's decision. So, um, this was, for all his rhetoric of self-determination, he was just an ideologue. Troops started returning home throughout 1918 and early 1919, which basically started another round of the Spanish flu, which had ravaged the U.S. throughout 1918, and actually possibly had originated in Kansas of all places. But it's called the Spanish flu because all the other nations engaged in the war had strict controls on their press, so the press couldn't publish that they were having massive amounts of people dying from this flu outbreak. But Spain wasn't actually part of the war, and so they didn't have any restrictions on their press. So that's why it became known as the Spanish flu, was simply because of censorship. Um, but this all these troops moving about gave a second wave to the Spanish flu that was much worse than the first wave. In fact, pretty much always the second wave of a major pandemic is going to be worse than the first, as we have just recently seen with the coronavirus. Um, and this was even worse because people were moving about. There were no travel restrictions back then. Instead, people were coming home and spreading it. It got so bad that in the US, around 600,000 people died from the Spanish flu. What was particularly brutal about the Spanish flu is that it actually hurt young people the most. Something about the this particular strain of flu made people's immune systems overreact, especially if they had a fairly robust immune system, meaning they were younger. So the people coming home were particularly harmed by this. And mind you, 600,000 people sounds like a lot, but it's even more than you think, because at this point there were only 100 million Americans. So imagine if it was 3 times that. That's how bad this outbreak of Spanish flu was. The Treaty of Versailles ultimately was concluded throughout early 1919, dividing up a lot of the world. All of Germany's colonial possessions were divided amongst the Entente powers, given as what were called mandates. Essentially, the Entente powers were supposed to govern these places in a period, an in-between period between colonialization and freedom. Of course, it was essentially just giving colonial possessions to another colonial power. The Ottoman Empire got split up in ways that would have lasting effects even today. For instance, the creation of basically the entire Middle East came from this treaty. So um, the creation of Palestine, which Israel did not exist yet, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, um, Saudi Arabia, all of the UAE, all of those were a creation of this treaty. Um, there was also there had also been a genocide of Armenians within the Ottoman Empire during this time, starting in 1915 and continuing all the way until 1918. Um, and so Wilson actually pushed to have a united Armenia. It's known as Wilsonian Armenia. But the Ottoman Empire um, basically managed to fight that off and maintain control of Armenia, at least their half of Armenia. There's the Russian half as well, which is what is today Armenia. Um, but well, this was actually one of the passionate things that Wilson tried to fight for. Something to keep in mind is that the Ottoman Empire is Muslim, whereas Armenia is Christian. So you can guess where Wilson's sympathies lied. But the Ottoman Empire did manage to stay alive and eventually became Turkey in 1922. Um, and that's also when they renamed Constantinople to Istanbul. Um, so this also all the Entente powers were allowed to keep their colonial possessions, but they were subsumed under this mandate system, right? This supposedly in between part of from being colonies to independence. Um, but in fact, there's actually still places that were under this system. For instance, uh, what the heck is it called? French New Guinea um, is still French, and in fact, the longest border of France is between France and Brazil. Funny enough, um, because of French New Guinea. Um, the so this whole system didn't really, this whole mandate system didn't really work. Um, and so um, a lot of this kind of ideology that Wilson kept espousing and it not being lived up to led to a huge amount of revolutions throughout 1919, especially when Soviet Russia was still um, thinking that they could push a world revolution. So a lot of Eastern Europe collapsed into to revolutions and civil wars, um, while France, and especially, but like the Entente powers overall, tried to cordon off um, the Soviets, um, and then there were revolutions as far afield as, well, more like revolts as far afield as like Korea, and the communist movement begins in China in 1919 with the May 4th movement, um, and that's where Mao Zedong gets his start. Um, so while the war to end all wars is supposed to, well, end all wars, there's certainly a lot of new ones starting in literally the year after, and a lot of it caused by Wilson's rhetoric of self-determination and not living up to that standard. Um, but also the Treaty of Versailles laid the seed for the worst conflict to come, World War II, particularly with the odious requirement of German reparations. Germany was required to pay reparations for having supposedly started the war. As we saw, that there's no real single entity that can be blamed. save for some random shooter in Sarajevo. But the Germans would would have to really bankrupt their economy to pay these reparations. And the U.S. did eventually kind of take pity for them and kind of create a system in 1924 to help them pay for this stuff through U.S. gold supplies. And in fact, Germany didn't pay off the reparations until didn't fully repay these reparations until the 1990s. So they would be paying this for another 70 years. Obviously there were points in that where they were refusing to pay, specifically the 1930s and 40s, but those payments were still due. But the crowning thing of the Treaty of Versailles was the creation of the League of Nations, which was essentially a predecessor of the United Nations today. The difference being that the U.S. didn't actually join it. And this was kind of the top, the crowning part of an arch that was necessary to bridge the span between warfare and peace. So the League of Nations would ultimately fail, where the UN has been quite successful. But the League of Nations also had some fundamental problems with it. It basically would require involuntary interventions. Woodrow Wilson certainly loved his interventions. And in other ways, it was too weak. It was without that, because obviously you can't actually compel people to intervene. And what would happen is that throughout the years, as countries refused to intervene in each other's affairs, the League would increasingly break up, and especially with the rise of the Nazis in Germany and the Japanese Empire, the League of Nations just couldn't handle the strain and did not survive World War II. Hence why the United Nations formed anyways. But the U.S. Really opposed the creation of the League of Nations, despite it being kind of Wilson's crowning achievement. He ultimately would fail to get the U.S. to join it. And so he went on a speaking tour throughout the U.S. trying to gain support for the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. And throughout that, he would miss what was going on right next to the train cars that he was riding. For the U.S. sank into what is known as the Red Scare throughout 1919. You might remember that the U.S. was still engaged in an intervention in Soviet Russia. So that was used as an excuse to use the Sedition Act on any kind of perceived Bolshevism in the U.S. As you could see in this this comic from the time, if there was any labor unrest, they'd start off with strikes. This was the perception, that they'd start with strikes, then get to riots, and then try to implement Bolshevism, which is truly murder, and then chaos. So you can see, like, the fear of the rise of Bolshevism was a key part of 1919. The people especially were afraid of anarchist bombings. For instance, there were a series of anarchist bombings, most particularly at the Bureau of Investigations, which was the predecessor organization, not the Bureau of, the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the Federal Bureau of an Investigation. The BOI, not the FBI, but the BOI was led by a guy named Palmer. And one of these anarchists tried to blow up his house and ended up blowing himself up instead. But, the fear was there, and Palmer was pissed. So he started working with what was known as the American Protective League, which was a citizen coalition during World War I that essentially was a spy network. But these were basically just people informing on each other, and they would join the APL, and send these reports. And these reports are actually freely available online. It's hilarious how many of them are like, the food at this Indian place is terrible. He must be a Bolshevik. So the spying was pretty ridiculous, but it was actually the worst domestic spying the U.S. has ever seen, and that includes the domestic spying we've seen recently with what was revealed by Edward Snowden and that recently. This was a pervasive network that had roughly around 1.5 million members. And they sent, all of them were sending out constant reams of reports about each other. So you don't need high technology to have a big spy network. What's even more interesting about this is that it was a private organization. It was not a part of the US government, even though the BOI would work with them. In fact, military intelligence worked with them at the beginning of this as well. The military intelligence, of course, had blown up in size during World War One. And so so everything that was seen as, anti-American was seen as these Reds rising up to overthrow the government. Sound familiar with, how much we've heard about Antifa recently? And it kind of culminated with Palmer raiding a bunch of anarchists and communists and socialists to find any subversives and arrest them under the Sedition Act. He did this throughout the fall of 1919. And eventually, he gathered all of the people who were foreigners, who, might be here on a visa. Some of them were actually American citizens, but gathered up a bunch of prominent anarchists, most prominent among them probably being a lady named Emma Goldman, a really famous anarchist, who possibly had a hand in the assassination of William McKinley years prior, but she wasn't deported then. But he gathered up all the foreigners, or the foreign-borns, or known at this time as aliens, and sent all the aliens packing on what's called the Soviet Ark. They were all packed onto a ship, about 300 of them, and sent first to Finland, and then forced to march across Finland into Soviet Russia. So the Soviet Ark was particularly brutal, to say the least. So these were all of this was happening right at the same time as the labor movement, seizing the opportunity that the war is now over, started doing a lot of strikes. Starting in Seattle with the general strike there in January of 1919. A general strike is, and we've talked about this with the labor movement, is when an entire city goes on strike. But even the Boston police went on strike, a police strike, and they were trying to form a union. This is a point where police didn't have the kind of power they have today. In fact, like most of them weren't even armed. Um, but the uh, the um, the governor of Massachusetts called in the National Guard to suppress the strike, um, and police were no longer able to strike, and the National Guard did the policing instead. That governor happened to be named Calvin Coolidge, and he'd use his fame to become president. Um, there was also a couple of national strikes for steel and coal to form a union of steel workers and coal miners. The steel one actually kind of worked because they did manage to unionize a lot of railroads. But once they degenerated into violence, it couldn't go anywhere. The coal strike, on the other hand, definitely didn't go anywhere, and its most important lingering affect was the Mingo Mine War, which we talked about in a previous lecture. But even worse than all of this violence breaking out was what's called Red Summer. Um, there was a huge amount of lynching during the war, a lot of anti-German lynching, um, especially in the West. But also, 1919 was the height of anti-Black lynching in the U.S. Um, there were more lynchings in the U.S. in 1919 than any other year. So there's a real rise in violence as veterans are coming back. And remember, um, there were a lot of Black veterans, as you can see here, a Black veteran versus a white veteran. And notice that the white veteran is the one that's armed. This is during the Chicago riot. The a lot of Black people coming back believed in what was called the New Negro, was essentially the predecessor to what we'll talk about in later lectures of the double V, where it's the double victory, at home and abroad, victory over oppression everywhere. But the New Negro was supposed to also be like self-assertive, and no longer willing to take the oppression of Jim Crow, which of course meant that the entire system of Jim Crow cracked down with lynchings and whatnot. There were a bunch of race riots, but probably the most important one was in Chicago, where some Black kids who were swimming in Lake Michigan there crossed the line into the white side of the beach, and a white man, a fully grown white man, pelted the kids with rocks. People, of course, got angry about, and by the way, one of these kids was killed by the rocks. And, you'd think that the police would arrive and, arrest the murderer. But instead, they arrested one of the protesters for inciting a riot. This spiraled out of control to the point that people were shooting at each other from across rooftops. There was over 1,000 fire bombings in Black neighborhoods, leaving thousands of residents without homes, and it took several days before the U.S. Army was actually called out to stop the violence, leaving more than 30 people dead. So, of course, all of this was subsumed under the Red Scare, and people thought that this whole new Negro movement was a front for Bolshevism. So that's where you'll find that a lot of race riots happened in summers. For instance, the George Floyd riots were happened during the summer. Um, the Ferguson riots happened during the summer. Um, the long hot summer of 1967, of course, happened during the summer. These things, there seems to be something correlative between uh, racial tensions building up and the heat. And so this was labeled Red Summer because of the supposed Bolshevism behind all of the racial violence, even though almost always this was started by white people, as we saw with Chicago. And throughout all of this violence happening during the Red Scare, Woodrow Wilson was campaigning for his League of Nations and the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. He never got it, but instead he ended up having another one of his strokes, which left him basically immobilized for the rest of his presidency, all the way into 1921. Um, so his wife would actually end up taking the responsibility of handing notes to his cabinet. Um, this has led many people to speculate that his wife was actually the one giving orders, but in reality, the main person who was who was basically running the administration was William Colby, his Secretary of State, um, who basically ran the administration for the rest of the time, um, since Wilson was mostly immobilized up until late in well, mid 1920. Um, with all of this tension around the Red Scare, the the um, the Bureau of Investigation doing all of this stuff, and uh, the Sedition Act being used to squash people, there was a real fear that May Day of 1920 would be, uh, you know, a revolutionary uprising of Bolshevism. Um, Palmer readied his forces, and a guy named the guy who would become important later, named J. Edgar Hoover, tried to create spy rings in all these labor organizations by uh, basically having a bunch of information on them. So he created basically a bunch of blackmail, um, and because he was a former librarian at the Library of Congress, but the but nothing happened, and so the Red Scare kind of petered out without anything more happening, despite the thousands of people who had died. Um, so, as you can see, World War One is quite a turning point in American history. It goes from the U.S. being fairly isolationist to um, having the kind of like head ideologue of the entire world as our president, um, and the sows the seeds of much chaos to come. Um, with that being said, the world ended up the following decade ended up being a great time, which we will talk about in the next session. Um, so we only have 5 minutes left. So hold on a second. Let me change it to. There we go. We only have 5 minutes left, and so we don't have much time for class discussion. But I'm hoping to have the midterm next week. So I wanted to discuss a little bit of what that entails. What the schedule next week will look like. Um, the that is, do we don't have spring break that week, do we? I don't remember which week is spring break. Can anybody does anybody know off the top of their head?
I believe it might be in 2 weeks.
Okay, that's what I thought. Good. I tried to put this thing together so that the midterm is right before spring break. I hate having to do it after spring break because everybody forgets everything over spring break, right? It's the week of the 15th. Okay, cool. Yep, I got my timing right. Good. So next week, we will basically not be having a lecture. There is a lecture. Technically there's we'll be talking about the Great Depression, but instead this will be a pre-recorded lecture. So you will have the option to, I mean, we can normally I would just play it in class, but well, this is digital, so I don't know if you guys want to just play it here. I would normally have somebody just play it for you guys and not be there, but that's not an option now. So depends on what you guys want to do, but I will be putting the link up there, and it's a lot faster. So it will, I believe it is an hour long. But it is essentially 2 lectures in one. So it's a full week done in about an hour. And the reason why that is the reason why it's so short is to make space for a study session that week. I've previously done this so that it's 3 days a week, but now it's only 2, so I have to futz with things. But so I will be putting that link up. Hopefully you guys can just watch it on your own time, and we will have a study session on Tuesday. And we won't have a Thursday one next week. The Thursday would normally be actually being in class and doing the midterm. So that's what next week will look like, is that you will have a digital lecture pre-recorded, and it's actually edited and everything too, so it's really fast and you won't have to hear me stuttering or even breathing. But the study session will be Tuesday. So be sure to attend on Tuesday, because that will help prepare you for the midterm, and the midterm will be available throughout all of spring break. That being said, are there any questions? Oh, and we still have lecture on this Thursday, though. Just to make clear, it's next week I'm talking about, that we'll have a study session Tuesday and then nothing on Wednesday. I mean, Thursday. But this Thursday, we're talking about the Roaring Twenties. Any questions?
And when are the journal due? When's the journal due?
Oh, so the journal will be due by the end of spring break. It will be Friday of spring break. The journal will be due. The first half of the journal, of course. And so you have the whole week to organize your thoughts on that. And it will be an upload thing on Learn. So I'll make it available probably like Wednesday of next week, and it'll be available from Wednesday till Friday. Same with the midterm. It will be available from Wednesday to the following Friday. So you will have more than a week to take the midterm and to turn in the journal. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, if there are any other questions, you can, of course, ask me. Otherwise, I will see you guys on Thursday. And have a good day.